Hello and welcome to the Room of Lives. I'm your host, Neil. In this episode, I'm talking to neuroscientist Rishidev Chaudhuri about how he underwent an intellectual trajectory. He began with studying physics, which has the philosophy of the platonic ideal, and arrived at the study of biology, which is more pragmatist. In his words, quote, "When I was younger, I thought that you could think your way to an understanding of the universe. As I get older, I'm more convinced that all of the interesting stuff happens in engagement with the world." End quote. Unlike physics, there is no fundamental theory of how brains work, and everything's messier. In this context, we ask, what is meant by a useful theory in science? At the end of this section, we discuss our views on the hard problem, the question of how consciousness appears in the material world. So you kind of touched on the pragmatism thing, but this is a whole other bullet point that you wanted to talk about, which is your intellectual trajectory, which was more platonistic in the past, and at the same time you were more interested in fundamental physics, and then you slowly kind of migrated towards a more pragmatist view, simultaneously with your interest in biology increasing. So I want to talk about this, but let's first kind of break down what we're talking about here into definitions. So if you could talk a little bit about what is Platonism, what connection does it have with fundamental physics, what is pragmatism, what connection do you see it having with biology?
Okay, so I guess I think of using Platonism as just kind of a shorthand for the sense that there are these kind of abstract formal structures that are really what underlies the universe, and that our intellect sort of attempts to reveal these structures to us. So the classic example people say is, well, what's a horse? How do I know a horse is a horse? Well, one way is that there's this ideal form of a horse. And then when I go out in the world and I see horses, I can compare that to, my internal intuition of these forms, this form of the horse. I'm going to try and match one to the other. And of course, the worldly horse is an imperfect horse. And, that's kind of a crude way of putting it, but I think you maybe see it in its cleanest form in fundamental physics, where you say, okay, well, what's really real about the universe? What's really fundamental about the universe? And so one perspective is, well, as a human being moving around the world, what's fundamental is just the things I encounter, the things that matter to me in my life. But another perspective is that, there are these abstract, timeless laws, in some sense these laws outside of space and time, that tell you, that basically lay out the script for how everything should act. And then we see the consequences of those laws. And then by looking closely into things, abstracting away from them, trying to move beyond them, we can start to return to these fundamental laws. And that these laws are the things that are really real, and everything else is kind of secondary or a consequence of that. And I think one of the things that does is it gives kind of it sees reason and rational thought in a very unproblematic, decontextualized way. It kind of assumes that you should be able to sit down and figure out. But it assumes that there is a way that the universe works, that's even a coherent thing to ask for, and B, that you should be able to sit down and figure that out. And, if you flip it around, I think there are a few different things I get out of pragmatism, but pragmatism basically tries to judge ideas and thoughts and, lots of other things by use. So the question becomes less, is an idea true? Maybe that's even a meaningless question, but more, is it useful? Is it productive? It's kind of like that cliched saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And a pragmatist would say, well, I don't see distinction. If it's a useful, productive model, then it's true. Philosophers spend a lot of their time worrying about questions or like making distinctions that don't really have any distinction in the actual world. And so I think pragmatism holds ideas much more lightly. It's a very rich intellectual tradition, but it doesn't think that this kind of process of rational inquiry kind of leads endlessly to some kind of foundational truth. Truths are contingent, they're contextual, and we should judge them based on how useful they are, how much growth they lead to. And I think when you're thinking about biology, this starts to become...
By the way, when you say useful, can we clarify a little bit what you mean by use? Is it predictability of a system, or what else?
Sometimes, and so this is where you sort of see the project. To some extent, we already have a sense, kind of a knowledge of use that we can try and unpick, and what useful is in one situation might not be what's useful in another situation. But within a particular context, we can often sit down and agree on what's useful or not. So we can sit down, for example, and look at ideas in computational neuroscience of the last 10 years. And I think we can probably come pretty quickly for many of them to discuss to an agreement on whether they've been useful or not. If you say, well, what's useful in general, I don't know if that has a particular answer. And again, in some sense, that's looking for these rational foundations. But within any particular context, I think it's often quite clear what's useful or not. And we can argue about it. We can sort of reason about it. It's not that we're just throwing away reason, but we're sort of saying that it exists within a certain context, within a certain kind of set of contingent rules, maybe within a certain language game, if you like, kind of like Wittgensteinian language, maybe within a set of customs. And so scientifically, you might say that, oh, this theory has been useful because it allowed us to predict something. This theory has been useful because it turned out to be a fertile way of thinking about this other system. This theory has been useful because, it kind of elucidated a piece of the puzzle, and then it kind of led us to see another piece of the puzzle, and so on. And then I think biological systems are very interesting because it's not clear that there really is, a fundamental theory in the sense of physics. I mean, so like evolution obviously is kind of, but even feels very fundamental, but even that's a different kind of theory from a set of laws that you just run through and then give you particular things. I mean, evolution is riddled with contingency. And so if you're studying the brain, you might say, well, what algorithm is the brain running, for example? That's that maybe feels like a fundamental law question. And again, I think that's kind of misleading because different brains from different animals, and different parts of brains evolve to do different things in different contexts. Maybe what seems like an algorithm in one context is not an algorithm in another context. Everything's messier, and everything feels, there's obviously there seems to be less of a distinction between this kind of like deep fundamental level where you reveal things, and then this level where you're kind of like unfolding it into the world.
Yeah. So now tell me a little bit about the trajectory itself that you experienced. Like when did this happen? How and why?
I think maybe the sort of focal point started to feel thinking of like I sort of late, maybe it started sort of late high school, but then through college, like being exposed to ideas again in like nonlinear systems, realizing that even pretty simple rules could both give rise to this baffling complexity, but then also realizing that maybe the rules themselves weren't what's maybe the most important or relevant part. Thinking about complex systems, I think, for example, like the example of statistical mechanics has been very useful to me. That feels like that's a very different area of physics. And the laws there don't feel any less strong in some ways, but they're not a consequence of some fundamental principle that's then being kind of unfolded. They're really statistical.
Like the second law, for example.
Yeah, and you have this interesting thing where you can have these many-to-one mappings. In some sense, the microscopic details of the system don't matter. You have simple behavior at the macroscopic level. And if you actually try to go from the microscopic to the macroscopic level, you can't. You'd probably be greatly misled if you actually try to take all the details into account. And then if you look, you've got to see this sort of thing everywhere. Like no one does chemistry by trying to solve the Schrödinger equation for more than one electron or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it turned out that, well, what seems to be fun, we have all of this simplicity and theory building at all these levels that doesn't seem grounded on some fundamental thing, and under some sort of fundamental law of physics, and doesn't seem to be reducible to it. And then, there's all the speculation that in physics too, once you drill down sort of to deep enough levels, you kind of, maybe these fundamental laws are actually something closer to the laws of statistical mechanics or thermodynamics. They themselves emerge from some sort of chaos and confusion. And so I think that's kind of one thread that really got stronger as I got interested in neuroscience and biology. And I guess maybe the other big thread is sort of personal. I think when I was younger, again, I thought that you could really think your way to an understanding of the universe. You could think your way to some kind of enlightenment. That a philosopher, for example, was someone who could sit down and think and figure out what was the good life and what is truth and what all these things mean. And I feel like as I get older, I get increasingly less convinced of that and more convinced that all of the interesting stuff happens in engagement with the world, in encounters. It's kind of contingent. It's often non-rational. People are not primarily these abstract rational beings. People are primarily something else, and we can talk. It's interesting to talk about what that something else is. But whatever that something else is, if I just look at how I feel put together, what motivates me, how I go about my day, I feel like this kind of abstract rational piece feels like only a very small piece of feels like only a very small part. It's a very important part, and it kind of drives most of my work. But it doesn't feel. It feels like there's almost like the philosophical mistake to take this small piece of what a human being is, and really say, well, that's where we get truth. And so then if you say, well, if in the rest of life, I don't think that we should be looking for fundamental ideas. I don't think we should necessarily be reasoning through everything, and that kind of like moves backwards into, the sciences doesn't mean we should be irrational, but it means the sorts of principles and ideas we look for are different.
Yeah. Okay, so you said something kind of interesting there. By the way, a lot of what you're saying about your intellectual trajectory very closely mirrors my own. So that's kind of because I also got into nonlinear dynamics and came into computational neuroscience. And as far as the intellectual trajectory is concerned, it's kind of been the same for me. But I feel like in some ways, mine has swayed to more radical extents, but maybe not. I don't know. But you said, okay. So
more radical extents in what way?
Okay, so we'll get to this. I'll ask you about your thoughts on the hard problem of consciousness. And I was thinking, what if Rishi asked me back what my thoughts are? And my answer would be that at this point, I don't really think that the answer will be in some sort of materialistic origin. So, okay. But, so you said something about, okay, what if human beings are not just the rational abstract entities that we usually imagine ourselves to be? Then what are they? So what is it that you think? What else do you think comprises being human, or being alive, or
I mean, there are a number of interesting questions. I think it's sort of hard to talk about because it's so close. It's hard to put in language. I think. And I feel like one very appealing set of ideas comes from Heidegger, in like places where he's trying to point to maybe not. So for example, here's this example that I like. A philosopher kind of adapted, but a philosopher often sits and sees human beings as kind of subjects acting on or considering objects. And if you actually look at what someone's doing, it's much less like that. It's like as you go about your everyday world, if you're hammering, you're just hammering. But you're not doing it in the way that a mindless automaton would do it. You have things like goals and projects, you're directed at things. You're able to use a hammer because it emerges out of some context in the world. So there's all of this kind of rich human structure, but a lot of it's pre-rational and tied to it's tied to behavior, it's tied to context. I guess, maybe in some ways I only have a set of probably like partial, unsatisfying answers to this question, and I think I don't think there really is a good answer. I think I've been very taken by some I think another person who's very important to me in thinking was Wittgenstein, and these ideas that maybe these slightly behaviorist views of language, but thinking about language as kind of emerging from human activity and as being ways of helping to organize human activity and sort of really being grounded in human activity. And so I think often, if you want to understand what human beings are, I think the way to understand that is to look at what they do rather than necessarily what they think. And that often thought comes after. Here's another example I like, the pragmatist, like William James, and people say that, well, we often think that, you cry because you're sad, you run away because you're afraid. But another way of thinking about this is, well, crying is part of what it means to be sad. Running away is part of what it means to be afraid. And so they've kind of collapsed this distinction between this abstract, unobservable state that then leads to an action into that action. And if you push it too far, I think it becomes kind of a behaviorism that sort of loses a lot. But I think there's a lot that's useful in what they're doing. They're saying, we take this web of actions and activities and practices, and then we abstract out of it that, and then we reify our abstractions and think about them as these underlying states or these driving forces. And they're not. They're just sort of abstractions from this kind of lived context.
Yeah.
But I do think, any particular field, any discipline has a set of tools, has a set of boundaries, and I think it has certain things it excludes. And I always think that's very valuable to kind of... So, for example, I don't think that there's kind of a master discipline that...
Yeah.
I don't think reality has to be non-contradictory.
Yeah.
But I'm not, quite sure what makes the... And I think it's a very sort of interesting... There are all these, there are different answers in Buddhist traditions or Zen or... but I think there's this kind of trope that is kind of constrained.
Yeah.
It's little rational ego is not quite right.
Yeah. So the nature of the universe is already very complicated, and the nature of our immersion in this web of causes and effects. But something that makes it doubly complicated is that this mind, or whatever it is that's immersed in this web, is trying to understand the web, and it has a certain way of going about it. And the human mind, the rational mind, wants to conceptualize and abstract away. But that is a certain kind of bias that it has. And sometimes it leads you to conclusions that are unnatural. So you've built this kind of arbitrary boundaries around some part of that web, and you're giving it a name. And once you give it a name, other people will start using that name, and people will start thinking of it as an object. And as you start thinking of it as an object, we interact with that idea in a certain way as a result or a consequence of that language. And the whole thing is kind of, sometimes I feel like, is there an end to this rabbit hole of trying to understand things?
And it's not, I don't think it's a bad thing, but this is also part of what it means to be human. We're, we're acting in the world, we call things names, we bracket off objects, and that all seems very valuable, and I don't want to get away from that.
Yeah.
I think the solution is not to try and run away from the everyday activity into this kind of groundless state, because I don't think that quite exists. It's kind of, in some sense, realizing that they both, kind of being immersed in the kind of the flow of everything without clinging to it, without taking it for, it's like the Buddhists always warn against clinging to emptiness. And I feel like it's that you kind of, you don't get away from it, and because you can't get away from it, because you're just retreating into another abstraction. But again, I feel like the pragmatists come to the rescue. You kind of figure out what a rich and fulfilling life means, and that means different things at different times, and the process of doing so isn't necessarily rational, and then you kind of live in a way that's sort of open to the world and in service of that.
So here's something that I was kind of interested to hear you talk about. You wanted to describe how the philosophy of pragmatism or behaviorism, or the ideas of Heidegger, inform us on ways of thinking about the mind and the world.
Yeah, this is something I'm just getting started on, and I'm sort of hoping to, actually when I'm going back to India, I'm hoping to do a bunch of reading and thinking about this. So I talked a little bit about, what are ways of the brain, thinking about the brain that don't foreground notions of information or representation that don't really, there's still, I feel like there's a lot of what we're doing, we're thinking about, like to use like Rorty's term, like the mind is a mirror. We're thinking about, and what I'd love to do, because a lot of these ideas especially are pretty vague, they could be full of fluffle, I know. I want to see if I can put them together in a creative way and try and use these ideas to actually get insight into particular neural systems. What I'd ideally like to be able to do is to say, hey, here's this neural system that looks really complicated when you try and understand it in terms of information processing or representation. But here's another perspective that maybe, puts the world back into the picture, or tries to take into account behavior more, that in some ways like radically simplifies it. And you don't need to have all of this philosophical mumbo jumbo around it to see why this is more useful than that in this context. And again, I think being pragmatic about this means sometimes thinking about the brain as this big representational machine is the right thing to do. And sometimes thinking about it as this crazy dynamical system coupled to the world is the right thing to do. And so I feel like in kind of like the more long-term philosophical projects, I want to take some of these kind of like slightly floaty ideas about thinking about humans as not as subjects acting on objects, thinking about brains not as these representational machines, and turn them into actually practically useful ideas for understanding particular neural systems. Though I don't quite know how to pick them apart yet. I think there's a lot of interesting work, for example, in the pragmatist that I need to go back and read.
Yeah.
I feel like they just feel like people like William James just feel so shockingly modern in so many ways.
But it's interesting that you're letting these philosophies kind of inform you and guide you, at least in terms of the questions that you want to ask and the kinds of answers that you would prefer over others, depending on the context. That's kind of interesting then.
I think it's one of the fun things about neuroscience. You get to, in physics, it feels like, well, this is not true and it's probably going to upset the physicists, but it feels like we kind of agree on what questions we should ask. We just don't know the answers. And I feel like in neuroscience, we don't know what questions we should ask or how to recognize the answers when they show up. And that, I think, one of the things that makes it really fun.
I think part of the reason is that with neuroscience, you're getting closer to whoever is asking the question. And so things become kind of subjective there.
Yeah.
So as a logical extension of what I just said, I want to get your thoughts. This is just pure speculation zone now. I want to get your thoughts on consciousness, specifically the heart problem. How do you think the nervous system gives rise to the consciousness? Or do you think it does?
Yeah, I'll probably give you a...
What does pragmatism have to say?
I'll probably be unsatisfying about that. I feel like, I feel like there are a lot of like partial answers and interesting questions. It's not even clear to me that the questions is well posed or like what it would mean or how we would know if we had an answer to it. It's not clear if we could have a... I guess maybe there's maybe like kind of like a related question in how do we, we have these good material theories of the world and then we have this sort of like qualia level of things and how do we fit those together? And at the moment I don't think we do. I'm not convinced that we will. It seems perfectly reasonable for me for the world to feel contradictory, for us to have partial non-overlapping theories.
Could you unpack that last sentence?
For the world being contradictory?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like, again, if you think that, there's one master theory of the world, then that needs to be able to explain everything and not contradict itself. And so it needs to be able to explain both how, in theory, we could predict the motions of atoms, and at the same time make room for some notion of free will, and for some notion of, the subjective texture of experience.
Sure. But those two are very different things.
There
could be subjective experience without there being any free will.
Yeah, but I guess they both seem like things that contradict a purely materialist theory of... And so, okay, maybe let's leave out free will. You have this theory that describes the universe at one level, and you have a theory that feels like it describes the universe at another level. And you say, well, can I have one overarching theory that sort of accounts for them both? And it's not obvious to me that should even be possible. And so, for example, I'm sure like someone like Kant might argue that, well, we can only have, our knowledge of the material world is structured through particular channels and can only take certain forms, and so it's never going to be able to explain everything, including sort of experience of what it is like to be a human being. It also feels like, as I said, maybe it's, maybe they're just two different views of the same non-contradictory thing. Maybe we just have these contradictory theories. I think there's lots of exciting work to be done. But again, the flip side is anything we say comes from a particular position and is limited by the kind of resources and ideas and experiences we have access to. And so I guess what I'm interested in is finding the most interesting or useful thing that can be said, rather than, because a lot of the time they're problems that just seem like they're sort of a huge problem that then turn out just not the sort of problems can often dissolve. And so this might turn out to be one of those. But I think, yes, I don't know how productive it is to ask it in the abstract.
Yeah.
I think you might want to ask particular questions, like what do we mean when we talk about the experience of red in this situation? And I think, but yeah, so I guess that's why I said it probably wouldn't be too satisfying.
Yeah.
I think thinking about the neural correlates of consciousness seems as, kind of easy problem seems more productive, and I think will lead to interesting thinking about, maybe qualia. But I'm not sure that it does. I feel like a lot of the attempts I see really start from within an incomplete theory of the world and then try and reach out and grab something that it seems like. Why? What do you think?
What do I think? Well, my views on this have changed a lot, especially in the last couple of years. Some of them have, mostly because of first-person experiences, either through meditation or through psychedelics or whatever, combination of both, or sort of thinking about these. Okay, I want to give you like a compact description. As far as the science of understanding how the world operates at a material level, like the physics, chemistry, biology, I think it all has its place, but I'm not convinced that those pursuits will ever give us an explanation for what gives rise to consciousness. At some fundamental level, I just don't see, because it's hard to explain this, but everything that we observe is within the realm of consciousness. So in terms of what will you explain consciousness? You can only explain consciousness in terms of objects or thoughts or ideas, which are all already being held by this vessel of consciousness. So you're putting the cart before the horse. So I don't really think there will be a materialistic description of consciousness. If you think about materials, what are materials? Well, here is our raw sensory input, and we're inferring materials and objects from our raw sensory input. So you're already going several steps, abstracting away from your raw input, and then you're trying to explain the raw sensory phenomena through this. It's all kind of circular. So then does that mean that this whole pursuit of science is kind of futile? I don't think so, because as far as we can see, whatever this is that we're immersed in, and I don't know what the origin of this is, because I don't know what consciousness is. For all we know, this might be some sort of simulation. And in the real world in which this simulation is running, this consciousness that's playing this game or whatever is being given rise to by some completely different mechanism, and the brain is just this arbitrary thing in this simulation that is kind of like is a distractor. I mean, it could be that. I mean, there's nothing that your science can find out that would contradict that theory. And there's a bunch of other theories of what reality is that I don't see any experiment that you could do in physics or chemistry that could invalidate those ideas. So for the moment, let's just forget about this big question and see, okay, what can science still give us? And what it can give us is, it can tell us, as far as the laws of the universe operating at a material level are concerned, these are those laws. These are the laws of the game that we're immersed in. And it seems like if you if you believe in these ideas of like kinetic energy or potential energy or material or atoms or electrons, it makes the whole thing very clear. But that's all they are. They're like kind of concepts. The only reality is the raw sensory experience. And if tomorrow that raw sensory experience changes, so for example, if someone's amygdala is firing a lot but they're feeling like super chill, then you would have to go in and hunt for a theory that explains how the amygdala could not be producing anxiety or fear. So the cache value is in the raw sensory experience, and then so then you have to figure out the new rules of the game. And such, sort of paradigm shifts have happened multiple times in the past, sometimes prompted by radically new experimental observations. And I feel like when it comes to understanding the brain, I would not be surprised if such things happen, that completely. And because the rest of our science is kind of built on top of whatever this sentient being is observing, it has the potential to topple a lot of this cathedral that science is building, depending on what we find out. For example, I was just thinking about this. What if it turned out that, what if it so happened that scientists went into the brain thinking, oh, this is where it all comes from, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and they found just this gaping void, and then everything would have to change. But none of the laws of science or chemistry or biology, we would have to think of it, it just means that consciousness is not what we thought. It isn't originated by the brain. So I feel like, it's all fine, the kind of science that I do, but there are certain dogmas that come with the materialistic philosophy of science, and a lot of scientists have not read about this or have not been taught about this explicitly to make a distinction between the science itself and the dogmas that it propagates. For example, one of these dogmas is that everything has a material origin. And if you press people, they'll say, oh yeah, of course we are not sure about that, but that's the kind of viewpoint that they carry around. Anyway, so there's a lot of questions there, but
and the first part of that argument does sound sort of Kantian to me.
Okay, it does.
The first part of your argument before the simulation, I don't think.
Yeah, well, I did a 6-hour-long podcast with my roommate here about, and the question was, is life a simulation? But then I went into the Hindu ideas of Maya and whatever. There's this whole, they have their own ideas about what reality is, and it's some kind of dream where separation is illusory, etc. But anyway, so all I'm willing to say now is that now I know much better the limits of the kind of knowledge that science like physics, chemistry, or biology gives you. And I'm a lot more aware of giving up the ground that I did not, rightfully conquer. Like, I don't actually know if consciousness is given birth to by the mind, by the brain. So that's kind of the short version. Yeah. Well, this is the end of the first part of the podcast. I kind of broke it up into 2 chunks. So if you want to take like a bathroom break or something, like a 5-minute break, and then we'll start with the second.
Thank you for visiting us today in the Room of Lives. In the next episode, Rishi talks about the time he was wandering around Kolkata as a journalist and working on a cookbook.